Hey Southern Nightmare fans, we have a book coming out. You can go to Amazon.com right now to pre-order the Southern Nightmare Companion ebook, which is coming out September 15th. If you want a deeper dive into the epic story of how the South Side Strangler was brought to justice, you won't want to miss this book. It's going to include lots of extra stuff we didn't have time to get into in the podcast, plus bonus content like interview transcripts and photos. If ebooks aren't your thing, we'll also have a paperback edition coming out. And everyone who donates at the $10 or more level on our Patreon page will get a free copy of the ebook. So you can help us fund Season 2 and get something a little cooler than a tote bag in return. Just go to southernnightmare.com/donate and donate $10 to get your free Southern Nightmare ebook and access to bonus content like extended interviews and a video of our 1-hour live show. Okay, back to this week's episode.
The following program contains mature content about crimes involving rape, murder, and sexual assault. Listener discretion is advised.
Previously on Southern Nightmare.
He doesn't know anything, but he's being told how he supposedly did it. And that was the confession.
It was March 1989. Stay-at-home mom Debbie Smith was cleaning up around the house when she noticed her clothes dryer wasn't working right. So she went outside to check on the exhaust vent. Debbie's husband Rob, a Williamsburg, Virginia police officer, was upstairs sleeping. He had been on duty for 36 hours straight when he hit the bed, and he was out for the count. Here's Debbie telling her story at the Southern Nightmare live show in May at Virginia Commonwealth University.
As a police officer's wife, I knew you leave your doors locked. But I thought, I'll just leave it unlocked for a few minutes when I came back in from checking the exhaust vent, because I thought I will grab the trash and just come right back out. But before I could come back out, within less than 5 minutes, a masked stranger came in that door, forcibly took me out of my home to the woods behind my house, where he robbed and repeatedly raped me.
When the ordeal had ended, the masked attacker marched Debbie back out of the woods, leaving her with a warning.
And I really thought that he was going to shoot me because he said that he had a gun. I never saw the gun because I was blindfolded. And then as I walked further, he said, "And lady," I said, "What?" And he said, "Locking doors." Those words sent chills up my spine, and they do to this day. And he said to me, "You remember, I know where you live, and I will come back to kill you and your family, or your family, if you tell anyone." But I did tell someone. As soon as I was allowed to leave those woods, I ran upstairs, and I woke my husband with the only words I could get out of my mouth. And all I could say was, "He got me, Rob, he got me." His first instinct was to call the police, and I begged him not to, because I didn't want to get anybody else involved with this, because I feared that this man really would come back and kill me, or worse, he may grab one of my children. My children were 12 and 13 at the time. But I'm thankful that my husband looked past my tears. He looked past my cries. And he said, "Honey, you've got to go to the hospital. We need to talk to the police, and then you need to go to the hospital and allow them to take the rape kit." And I just couldn't even imagine going through something like that after just having been raped by this man. But he helped me to do what he knew that I couldn't do on my own that day. And I will be forever grateful to him for helping me to do that. He refused to let my tears keep him from helping me to make those hard decisions.
Debbie's decision to collect the evidence from her rape would turn out to be momentous, not only for her, but also the nation. From True South Media in Richmond, Virginia, in cooperation with Style Weekly and WRIR 97.3 FM Richmond Independent Radio, this is Southern Nightmare, the story of how the South Side Strangler was brought to justice. I'm your host, Richard Foster. The history of how DNA testing came to be law enforcement's top investigative tool begins in 1980s England with a killer with the unlikely but unbelievably appropriate name of Colin Pitchfork. In November 1983, 15-year-old Linda Mann was found raped and strangled to death on a lonely footpath in the rural village of Narborough. 2.5 years later, the body of another raped and strangled 15-year-old girl, Dawn Ashworth, was also found on a secluded trail in the woods. At first, police focused their attention on Richard Buckland, a 17-year-old with learning disabilities. Under police interrogation, Buckland had confessed to killing Dawn Ashworth. However, he would soon become the first person in history to be exonerated by DNA evidence. Not too long before Dawn Ashworth's body was found, a genealogist at the nearby University of Leicestershire had developed the early technology for what would come to be known as DNA profiling. Comparing DNA samples from Buckland with semen samples taken from the victims' bodies, Sir Alec Jeffreys was able to prove that both girls had been killed by the same man, and furthermore, that Richard Buckland didn't commit the murders. From there, local police would take the unprecedented step of launching a genetic dragnet, soliciting thousands of DNA samples from every local man between the ages of 13 and 33. In August 1987, a woman at a local pub overheard bakery worker Ian Kelly brag that he had taken the DNA test in the name of his buddy, Colin Pitchfork. Sure enough, when police interrogated Pitchfork, he confessed to the murders. His DNA matched the semen samples from the bodies. Pitchfork had escalated from exposing himself to committing sexual assaults, to rape and murder. He was well on his way to becoming a serial killer. Pitchfork was arrested on September 19, 1987, the same day that the South Side Strangler killed his first Richmond victim, Style Weekly magazine employee Debbie Davis. Before the advent of DNA testing, dusting for fingerprints and comparing blood types were the most scientifically advanced ways to link a criminal to a crime scene. Police in the 1980s were still using virtually the same forensic science technology that had been groundbreaking when Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was writing about it in his Sherlock Holmes stories in the late 1800s and early 1900s. It is really hard to understate how little the public knew about DNA in 1988 when Timothy Spencer, the South Side Strangler, became the first man to be sentenced to death on the basis of DNA evidence. For most people back then, DNA was something you vaguely remembered being brought up in high school biology class. DNA wouldn't really enter the popular consciousness until 5 years later, in summer 1993, when director Steven Spielberg brought his latest summer blockbuster to the screen.
Dr. Grant, my dear Dr. Sattler, welcome to Jurassic Park.
Oh, Mr. DNA, where did you come from? From your blood. Just one.
Today, everybody knows about DNA. For under $100, you can buy a consumer DNA kit, swab your cheek, and find long-lost relatives, or learn if you have Neanderthals in your family tree. But the Spencer case happened long before TV shows like CSI or NCIS brought DNA and forensic science into our living rooms. It was 7 years before DNA testing became national news in the O.J. Simpson double murder trial.
The finding of that pattern in the console lane is consistent with a mixture of the banding pattern of the defendant, Mr. Simpson, and also the contribution from Mr. Goldman.
If it doesn't fit, you must acquit.
Heck, by the time Michael Crichton published the book Jurassic Park, Timothy Spencer had already been on death row for 2 years. So in the fall of 1987, when Spencer was in the middle of his killing spree, one man immediately saw the potential of using DNA as a tool to solve the crime. The late Dr. Paul Ferrara, who was the director of the Virginia Department of Forensic Science. Ferrara cited the successful use of DNA in solving the South Side Strangler murders as the argument for funding the creation of the nation's first criminal DNA database here in Virginia in 1989. That would in turn help inspire the establishment of CODIS, the FBI's National Law Enforcement DNA Database Network, which includes the DNA databases from all 50 states and Puerto Rico, as well as the federal government. As of this May, CODIS has produced over 422,000 DNA matches, assisting in more than 406,000 criminal investigations across the nation. Paul Ferrara was never a household name, but he is widely recognized by his peers as one of the fathers of this country's criminal justice DNA database system. He was even profiled by legendary 60 Minutes TV journalist Mike Wallace.
At first, the state of Virginia took DNA only from convicted sex offenders, but officials decided that was not enough after the case of Timothy Spencer. Before Spencer...
Here's Dr. Ferrara himself speaking with local radio station WRVA about the South Side Strangler case and the importance of DNA databases.
Everything points to a properly conducted, valid, and quite well-established identification. There's no doubts in my mind at all that the DNA results point to Timothy Spencer and no one else. If there had been a DNA data bank at the time when Spencer was committing his heinous acts, he had a previous conviction for which he would have had to give a blood sample and been a data bank, and presumably he could have been identified even earlier, before some of these other crimes.
Southern Nightmare will return after this message. Hey, Southern Nightmare listeners, you're going to love this special offer from Audible. They're offering you a free audiobook download of your choice to keep with a free 30-day trial to give you the opportunity to check out their service. They've got over 180,000 titles to choose from, pretty much anything you can think of, from classics to the latest bestsellers. You can listen on your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or MP3 player. I'm an Audible subscriber, and right now I'm listening to I'll Be Gone in the Dark, One Woman's Obsessive Search for the Golden State Killer by Michelle McNamara. It's true crime at its best. I highly recommend it. To download your free audiobook today, go to audibletrial.com/Southern Nightmare. Again, that's audibletrial, AUDIBLE, trial.com/Southern Nightmare for your free audiobook. Dr. Paul Ferrara was a national leader in establishing scientific standards for DNA testing in criminal cases, says Ken Melson, former acting head of the ATF and a past president of the American Academy of Forensic Sciences.
Dr. Ferrara was a tremendous influence in the forensic science world. His laboratory was just very advanced and proactive in all sorts of things. And all I can say is Paul Ferrara was a person who has led the field and will go down in history, I think, as one of the leading individuals, both with respect to the establishment of the DNA process in their laboratory, but also with respect to the quality assurance of their laboratory.
Best-selling mystery novelist Patricia Cornwell, whose debut novel, Postmortem, was based on the South Side Strangler killings, praised Dr. Ferrara in an interview with local TV station WTVR.
He's one of the sort of the Renaissance men of forensic science. Even though his specialty is molecular biology and DNA and things like that, he knows about it all.
Virginia has collected more than 435,000 DNA samples in its criminal offender DNA database. Since its creation in 1989, the state database has returned more than 12,000 matches linking criminals to crimes. It's also exonerated several people who were wrongly convicted. Earlier this year, Virginia's legislature voted to expand the state's DNA database to include samples from people convicted of misdemeanors, such as assault and battery and trespassing. If Virginia had been collecting this information in 2010, it would have likely prevented the 2014 abduction and slaying of 18-year-old University of Virginia student Hannah Graham. Her killer, Jesse Matthew Jr., was arrested for trespassing in 2010. By that point, he had already abducted, raped, and murdered 20-year-old Virginia Tech student Morgan Harrington, and he had also brutally raped another woman in Northern Virginia. DNA evidence tied Matthew to all three crimes. Privacy advocates generally oppose DNA databases, citing distrust of the government and how it can mishandle sensitive medical information that can be uncovered from DNA results, such as what diseases a person might be at risk of getting. And the ACLU of Virginia has opposed adding nonviolent crimes such as trespassing to the database, says spokesman Bill Farah.
Well, certainly we agree that cold cases should be solved, especially the heinous types of crimes that the DNA data bank was supposedly set up to prevent. But we have really serious concerns, constitutional concerns, about privacy and due process related to the existing database, because right now we collect DNA for all felonies and a number of misdemeanors. And for certain violent felonies, there's not even a conviction requirement. You get arrested for one of those crimes, and your DNA is going in the database. And that's, information that is the most personal, private information about an individual that they may not even know themselves, things about their ancestry, their lineage, diseases they may be susceptible to, predictive behavior. So, we really have serious concerns about the government taking that information at all, but certainly not for minor crimes and not without a conviction.
Advocates for criminal DNA databases point out that more than 60% of convicted criminals in the United States are likely to commit a subsequent crime. And like Spencer, many violent criminals start out with lesser, non-violent offenses like property theft or breaking and entering. Furthermore, when state forensic scientists perform DNA tests in criminal cases, they generally restrict the testing to so-called junk DNA, areas of DNA that don't hold any important information about a person. It's also against the law for forensic lab workers to release private information about an individual's DNA outside of the database. While criminal justice DNA databases have a proven track record for solving cold cases, one obvious drawback is that not everyone's DNA is listed in the National Databank. For instance, Golden State Killer suspect Joseph James D'Angelo, who was arrested in April, was a former police officer with no criminal record aside from a shoplifting arrest. He was the first and most high-profile murder suspect located so far by cross-referencing DNA tests with genealogy databases to develop suspects. Investigators found matches to the Golden State Killer's DNA in a genealogy database, and then they researched the killer's family tree until they located D'Angelo, who lived in the right area and matched the profile. It's expected that this genealogical database method will continue to solve more cold case murders that had previously stumped police. Just this month, police in Indiana used it to arrest a man who later confessed to the 1988 murder of 8-year-old April Tinsley. Back at the time of the Spencer case, forensic scientists couldn't foresee the great advances that would have taken place in DNA testing just 30 years later. In 1988, it could take months to make a DNA match, and technicians had to be careful to limit their exposure to the radioactive probes used in testing. Now DNA tests can be done in days, with no radiation necessary. Back then, to extract DNA, you needed a fairly large sample of blood, saliva, or semen, about the size of a quarter or $50. But today, scientists can find DNA in specks of matter invisible to the human eye. Forensic techs can recover DNA from perspiration inside clothing. They can even find DNA left behind from a person touching an object, such as a table or a doorknob. When Timothy Spencer was arrested, 6 segments of his DNA were tested, enough to calculate that the odds of any other African American sharing his DNA signature were 1 in 135 million. That was at a time when the entire African American population of the United States was only about 28 million. Today, scientists test 24 areas of a suspect's DNA. That's enough to calculate odds greater than the entire population of the planet Earth. Labs now use special probability software to calculate these mind-bendingly large numbers. Brad Jenkins, a DNA program manager for the Virginia Department of Forensic Science, explains how it works like this.
It's kind of like describing a car. If you said, I want to find a white truck, and so you name one characteristic, well, 2 characteristics, a white in a truck, there might be tens of thousands of those in Virginia, where if you said it's a white truck, it's a Ford, it's an F-250, it has a leather interior, it has this type of CD player, and it has white wall tires, and the first character on the license plate is an A, that becomes very pinpoint in that you're able to look at all those different points to describe that car. So that is really your long answer for you for that, is that if you have 1 or 2 areas of DNA, those types can be very common, and you can find other people in this room that have that DNA type. And if you have lots of DNA information up to 24 areas, that becomes very rare.
And that brings us back to the power of DNA databases and rape survivor Debbie Smith. The years following Debbie's rape were filled with fear and dread that her attacker might follow through on his threats and return.
During those 6.5 years, I became very suicidal. I didn't want to live. In fact, I thought that him leaving me alive was part of the cruel punishment, because now I had to live with this every day. I had to remember every detail every day. One of the things when a trauma like this happens is that you're robbed of the innocence of thinking that this can't happen to me, that it's always somebody else. So when you're robbed of that type of innocence, now you know that you're vulnerable for it. So you begin to think that you're vulnerable everywhere, all the time, and you never feel safe. I think for me, fear was probably the most invasive feeling that I had. I was always comfortable in my home. I always felt safe in my home. I always felt free to be who I was in my home. And now this had been taken from me. I also worried constantly about my children. Where were they? I had to know where they were at every moment because I was so afraid.
Virginia got the first hit from its DNA database in 1993. 4 years later, Virginia also made the first interstate hit, matching a criminal in Virginia's database to a rape committed in Florida. On July 26, 1995, the Virginia database returned a DNA match for the man who raped Debbie Smith. Her attacker was brought to justice as a direct result of the DNA database created because of the South Side Strangler case.
You know, DNA had solved my case and had changed my life. I mean, it was, I can't even explain to you the difference that it made in my life. It meant that my children could go off to a friend's house and I wasn't paranoid that this man was out there watching them. It meant that when my husband was a police officer at the time, before he retired, and I worried myself sick about him, that maybe he was watching him. And
at the trial, the man who raped Debbie would receive 2 life terms plus 25 years. That was when Debbie met Dr. Paul Ferrara. He had come to support his staff in their DNA testimony, but not long after, he got in touch with Debbie and asked if she would speak to a new federal commission he was serving on. Led by then U.S. Attorney General Janet Reno, the commission was examining the future of how forensic DNA evidence should be handled in criminal cases.
And Paul thought it would be a good idea if they could find a victim who had benefited from DNA to come and speak to that commission. And we talked, and I told them, no, there's no way I can do this. You don't understand who I don't even order a hamburger from McDonald's. I cannot go and talk to a panel of people that, you know, Gary Scheck was on the panel. There were chief justices on the panel. There were, you know, all kinds of very important people on this panel, and I just said, I can't do it. And I finally agreed to go because, again, my husband helped me to make those hard decisions. So I finally agreed to go, and after I spoke, Paul asked me if I would come and visit the lab. I said, sure. So I came and I got a nice tour of the lab, and they took me into a room, and I will never forget it, where from floor to ceiling, there was row after row of shelves. And there were all kind of boxes and bags and baskets of stuff. And I said, what is this? He said, these are rape kits that have never been tested. And so I said, what can I do?
In 2004, after years of lobbying by Debbie and Dr. Ferrara, Congress passed the Debbie Smith Act, which strengthened the National Law Enforcement DNA database and provided funding to reduce the backlog of untested DNA evidence. The act was reauthorized in 2008 and 2014. Because of this, Virginia is currently in the midst of reducing its backlog of 3,000 untested rape kits. The effort has already produced 90 DNA hits.
He was relentless on trying to make sure that this law got passed. And he was trying to make sure that people understood how important DNA is.
Today, Debbie is the founder and CEO of HEART, Hope Exists After Rape Trauma, a nonprofit organization that advocates for and supports victims of rape and sexual assault.
And I know that anything that I accomplish in this life is because of Paul Ferrara and his encouragement. The things that I thought that I could not do, between him and my husband, they said, you can do it. It was Paul who kept telling me, you keep fighting this fight. And I saw him just about 3 months before he died, and one of the last things he said was, you keep fighting for this man, because DNA is what it is.
If you couldn't hear that last bit, he told her to keep fighting for this because DNA is worth the fight. Dr. Paul Ferrara died of brain cancer at age 68 in 2011.
I believe he's responsible for the fact that we have a DNA databank in the United States. He was so committed to this. He was a special, special man, and he was a fighter. When he believed in something, he was going to do whatever he could to make sure that it happened, and I am so glad that he did, because without him, I don't believe we would have had a data bank. But to me, that's what his legacy is.
Next time on Southern Nightmare.
I thought about the necks those fingers had been around, and how many terrified women those fingers had assaulted.
Southern Nightmare is a production of True South Media in cooperation with Style Weekly Magazine and WRIR 97.3 FM Richmond Independent Radio. New episodes are released every Tuesday. It's recorded at Sound of Music Recording Studios in Richmond, Virginia. Our producer is John Morand. Original music by Daniel Davis. For exclusive extra web content, visit our website at southernnightmare.com. If you enjoyed this podcast, please make sure to leave a positive review on iTunes. It helps people find us. We'd like to give special thanks to everyone who gave their time to talk with us for this podcast and to you for listening. Pleasant dreams.